Hello everyone, to the final session of the day. We have a panel discussion with Professor Christel Devadawson, Ms. Dyuti Mittal, and Professor Shalini Srinivasan. I'll be introducing Professor Christel Devadawson to all of you because she spoke to us yesterday, but many of you were not there. So she's a Cambridge Scholar for her PhD. Christel Devadawson is Professor, Department of English, University of Delhi. Recent publication in the field of visual studies is Obedient Daughters and the Deployment of Graphic Types. It's published in Sultana Sisters, edited by Haris Kadir and P. Rafat. She curated the exhibition titled The Legacies of Laughter, Legacies of Loss, Pictorial Satire in Post-Independent India for Samanvaya, the Indian Literature Festival 2015. Christel's books include Out of Line, Cartoons, Caricature, and Contemporary India, published by Orient Black Swan in 2014, and Reading India, Writing England, published by Macmillan in 2005. So we have Professor Devadawson, Professor Srinivasan, and Ms. Dyuti Mittal in conversation with all of us. Please, may I invite?
Hi again, everyone. I think you sort of know all of us, so feel free to jump in if you have questions in between. I think we'll sort of start with a question that actually Dyuti brought up on our way to campus, right? And she was going, she sort of wanted to know, how would you put the boundaries on Indian graphics, right? What comes in, what's left out, what would you not consider a graphic at all, and so on. And we were sort of going over that a little bit on the way, so I thought we'd sort of start there. And talking about the boundaries in graphics and how you'd categorize them, but also a little bit about how you'd learn about them, right? How would you teach this? How would you learn it? How would you teach yourself to read an image? That kind of thing. So, Christel, if you'd like to start.
Let me cheer everybody up in this room immediately. Anyone who believes a course in visual culture is a little difficult to take is invited to design a course in visual culture. You will realize that things are ever so much worse on this side of the table. And let me begin by trying to respond to the question that initially Dyuti and now Shalini have asked. How does one set boundaries to this field? Now, when I was trying to rough out an MPhil course, one of the things I was told was, please indicate a lineage. A lineage as in conventional elite people will know when we begin with that hideous phrase, Henry Fielding was the father of the novel in English. You know, that kind of indicating in however vacuous a manner, a sense that this is not a discipline that sprouted overnight like a turnip. So I did then think of who are the illustrators whose work is sort of canonically known and recognized as being textbook illustration. And the fish on stilts, or the fish apparently on stilts, is a very late 19th century signature by Edward Lear. We'll know him best of all as the person who wrote The Owl and the Pussycat. This is how he used to sign himself off at one stage in his career. It's one way he used to illustrate his own poetry, which is why I first thought of him. This is one way I thought of his extending a certain kind of identity. After all, a signature is an identity of sorts. But you'll notice that he is pushing the boundaries of what otherwise would be commonplace beast fable illustrations. He does a fair bit of those in his time, and this is one way he has, as I said, of indicating where he's coming from. The next illustration is Aubry Beardsley, again very late 19th century, illustrating for Oscar Wilde's play Salome, again as with Lear, a sense that to, so to speak, run the two species together, beast and human, is one way of working around the moralities of the time. Particularly, it is one way for both of injecting a certain kind of gender fluidity into their identity, a certain component of transgressive potential. And then we get to another, yes, this then will bring us with a huge jump to the present day. And again, as with this slide and the next, Atul, if you'd like to run the next one on also. See, in both these cases, you will recognize these as illustrations from the first edition of Vikram Seth's Beastly Tales. And in both cases, again, this question of what constitutes identity, transgression, how do you place some things within the parameters of an argument, how do you police the parameters of graphic representation. You will notice that in both cases, the crocodile attempting to gorge on mangoes in the previous slide, the hare gloating over her participation in the race with the tortoise. In both cases, the illustrator and the poet, of course, in the first place, feminize figures that hitherto have been considered masculine. Speaking for myself, when I first encountered the story of the hare and the tortoise, never struck me the hare could be anything but a male hare. Just as in the previous slide, never thought the crocodile could be anything other than a male crocodile. So this is one way of pushing those boundaries, of insisting that things that have hitherto lain outside the parameters of discussion come in. Now, whether this is a particularly feminist take on illustration, I don't think it is, because Seth's first illustrator, these are the illustrations of Ravi Shankar, is very good at feminizing the 7 deadly sins. So, how feminist that argument is, I'd be shocked out of my skin, but nonetheless, to answer the question, these are some of the ways in which illustrators can push the parameters of that which is acceptable within the domain of the graphic.
Dyuti, do you want to sort of answer the question, how would you learn about, teach visuality to someone?
I'll come back to this later.
Christel, actually, I wanted to ask you a little bit that, I mean, you're saying that you'll sort of trace the lineage, for lack of a better word, of comics, graphic narratives to this kind of illustration. Where then would you sort of place the boundary, right? Where would you say, okay, this is now a graphic novel, this is now a cartoon, this is now a illustration? How would you?
With illustration.
So, Christel ma'am, you talked about Edward Lear, and I was thinking of like going a little further back and maybe talking about Blake, for example, and his illustrations, and how do we read them, alongside his poems, and would we consider them in the same vein as that?
The reason I didn't pick Blake was very simple. I'm relatively ignorant about Blake's about the larger consequences of Blake's work. But to answer specifically that question of illustration, I find Blake's illustrations difficult to deal with because the sense of overwhelming complexity that comes up with the poems. For instance, the pairing of the Holy Thursdays, the pairing of the Divine Images, prelude in both cases. It seems to me that the illustrations, I will not say that they prettify the text, they don't do that. At the same time, and this may be my ignorance, they do not suggest to my mind the depth of moral complexity that the poetry does. Whereas, but I think largely because the poetry is happy to transgress. The poetry, in fact, insists on transgressing. With the illustrations, the technique is transgressive. To the best of my knowledge, the content is not always transgressors. So I will stop there. Okay, with regard to illustration, I'm going to build on a statement that Dyuti made, that usually the visual text follows the literary text. When you talk about storyboarding, it is after you go through storyboarding that you start working on the visuals. With regard to caricature or cartooning, I would, if you held a gun to my head, I would insist on distortion along with recognition as being an essential component. Now, whether the distortion feeds into comedy for the subject or whether the distortion feeds into comedy for the viewer/reader, that might vary. I'm ready to say that. But as I say, I would insist on distortion for the purpose of a particular kind of recognition.
Yeah, I also think caricatures are very characteristic of abstraction. So capturing the essence of something and getting rid of all the peripheral layers is very important. So just getting to the essence and the and that central point of whatever you're talking about. Yeah, that's very important.
And you've done that in a couple of cases.
Yes.
Would you like to sort of tell us how you?
So for example, for Flaw, the entire narrative was much more complex, but I kept abstracting it further down into symbolism. The challenge that I gave myself was to make it a complete design project wherein I'm not using any excessive peripheral layers to express the content. I should just express as much as I need to based on the functionality of the content. So, I made it as abstracted and basic as possible. And caricatures do it in a different way with distortion. So, caricatures also do that same, incorporate that same level of abstraction. Yeah.
With Flow, of course, I mean, your abstraction was also often like to sort of reduce things to numbers, like it's
Yes.
I was very baffled by when I read Flow many years ago. So. Sorry, I was very baffled when I read Flaw many years ago because Dyuti sort of abstracts a lot of things to numbers, and as someone who was not trained in numbers, I got very baffled by it. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yes. My mic is not working, I think. Hello? Hello? Okay, lovely. Thank you. So Flaw, as I've spoken about a little bit, was about expressing a philosophy, which was a metaphysical philosophy about incompleteness and completeness, wherein I'm trying to say we're neither everything nor nothing. We're something in between, and we're bound and destined to remain that something in between, which is constantly dystopic and constantly grey, and neither complete feeling nor complete seeing. So I use numbers 0 and 1 based on Hindi mythology to depict 0 to depict nothingness and 1 to depict everything. And by that logic, I depicted us, which is what lies between 0 and 1, as number 2, based on the forms of numbers 0, 1 and 2. And I related the forms of the numbers 0, 1 and 2 to other objects which had similar forms, which meant similar things. And I'm proving in the story that if 0 is equal to 1, I'm proving in the story that 0 is equal to 1 and 2 lies between 0 and 1. So the number line should be 0, 2, 1 and not 0, 1, 2. Right. Absolutely.
You also mentioned earlier today you were talking about conventions, like visual conventions.
Yeah.
Visual conventions that you think need to be broken, need to be challenged. Are there any visual conventions that you do follow or guides that you think are important for your art?
Yeah, okay. So firstly, the convention of, I don't really know how to define, whether I can define my breaking conventions as a convention. Can I?
Please go ahead.
Okay.
Please.
So in that sense, if the conventions I'm breaking can be a convention, then those are the conventions that I follow. That's a very stupid answer, but that's the first thing that comes to mind. But other than that, there are some things that I do adhere to, which is say.
The left to right and the directional
Left
flow.
to right, then having text and image both, which is obviously a convention, and which is what makes it a graphic novel. If you're breaking all the conventions, then you left questioning whether it is a graphic novel anymore at all. But it is a graphic novel because there is still an interplay between text and image, and that is where the convention is retained. And of course, going from left to right is another convention I'm following strictly. Yeah, I think these come to mind for now.
Also, if I may add, the way in which you sort of modify the panel structure of a page to do all kinds of other things, to sort of take the reader in specific directions.
Right.
I was sort of struck by how you do that fairly consistently across a lot of the stuff I've read.
Yeah, so that's one way where I'm breaking the convention, and I just in terms of the lines, the way I draw my lines, the philosophy behind it is that I believe that we need more depth in the world. We need to go into more depth into everything in the world, and so my lines sort of traverse all the grooves and edges, bits of, like breaks into little grooves and bits, because I want to capture the sensitivity and the depth of life through my lines. As far as the scene goes, the reason I visualize it in that kind of a manner is to create a sort of mystery, I think. So to not make it as obvious as it is, and to guide the eye in a way that I feel the viewer's eye should be taken through. So, I'm kind of controlling the viewer's eye by doing that. Whereas when you have panels, it's very obvious that the viewer will look from left to right and bottom, and so yes, I have the power to guide the viewer's eye using drama, using volume, using flow, using bigness and smallness. So yes, that's the idea. Yeah.
I would just pitch in by asking Dyuti over here, guiding the viewer's eye, would that also be directing the viewer's perspective? But not necessarily for purposes of judgment, but simply to get the accents falling in the places that work best for the story.
I wouldn't think I'm guiding a viewer's perspective, because my work is still very open-ended in terms of interpretation. So, no, I would say no. I think guiding the eye is a way for you to set a sequence, but not necessarily set the meaning. Yeah.
Does that work differently in cartoons, Christel, where it's sort of typically one panel, and so the nature of the focus works differently?
The nature of the focus does work differently, largely because there is an insistence on a prior judgment. But I will also say that it is not only because cartoons tend to be typically either pocket panels or maybe stretching it to a sequence of 3. I think it's because pictorial satire very strongly pulls away from fictionalizing. because fictionalizing implies time sequence, a certain kind of narrative, and with narrative of any kind, there is always an impulse to make space for compassion, forgiveness, tolerance. I don't think pictorial satire pushes for tolerance. I think it pushes for not just judgment of the gallows kind, but also an insistence on telling people you cannot sit on the fence. You have to take a position, whatever the position might be, and yes, to that extent, it does differ.
Can I ask you a sort of follow-on type question about this, where you're saying that pictorial satire is very strongly pushing the needle in one direction? Do you think that, I mean, is that sort of consistent across the Indian mainstream cartooning world? Are there cartoonists who tend to think differently?
I think that's by and large consistent with regard to this genre of pictorial protest across the world. Because if you look, for instance, at, say, Steve Bell in Britain, if you look at Cal in the United States, they are massively judgmental to a point beyond punishing. And if, for instance, the Guardian every day brings out a panel that represents only the blonde thatch on the head of the present Prime Minister, one simple way of saying is, well, obviously they don't think he carries more weight. But if that is something that is done on a day-to-day basis, as it is, then we have to accept that that is very much a given with the turf. And I think one of the great tragedies in India is that when we look at people like Lakshman, because we see the common man bobbing up and down, we tend to think of this being friendly, middle class, accepting, when it's nothing of the kind. Lakshman is as excoriating, thankfully, as anybody else.
Can I also ask about gender? How does gender work in this kind of cartoon? I'm saying this also partly because I think a lot of our canonical cartoonists like Lakshman tend to be men. So,
see, we have Manjula Padmanabhan at present working on Suki. She worked on Suki up to a saturation point, gave it up, and has returned. But it's my concern with gender is not just whether we have women engaged in pictorial satire or not very much, the number is increasing, but more than that, my concern with gender here is it not being invisibilized, or is it not being visibilized in ways that we might not find exactly progressive? These illustrations are one example. Another example would be the way in which sort of repeatedly the comic stereotypes on which pictorial satire function, not political pictorial satire, but say social satire that gets into the Sunday papers. The hardy old chestnuts of women who drive, women who go out to work, those have reduced over the years. They haven't disappeared. And that, to my mind, is absolutely disgusting. It's very strange that the form should not stand up and take its share of moving forward.
Yeah. Yes, influences my work. Yeah, so, you know, I've had a lot of experiences with touch where consent was completely, where the point of consent was completely missed, and I find it extremely exhausting to go through that as a woman, and that really drives my work. So I do analyze consent very minutely through my work. I also talk about harassment, physical, sexual abuse through my work. I analyze experiences I've had with touch as well as harassment for what it really is, to really understand what my role in it is, where I stand, where the other person stands, what the context is, and analyze every bit of where where something was justified and where it wasn't. So that's where gender plays a role in my work. And yeah, it comes from the fact that I'm a feminist, and I really feel that we live in a space where there is certainly discrimination against women, and there is certainly oppression of women in relationships, and I think that it's very, very important that women speak up, even if it sabotages their careers, and make an example for the fact that it won't sabotage their careers. You know, that speaking up will strengthen them, and that men need to be held accountable for where they're not being equal. Yeah.
Do you think there's more, I mean, and this is for both of you, do you think, like, I mean, over the last decade or so, there have been more women, I don't want to say cartoonists, because cartoonists, yes, but also in the graphic space.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you think that's changing the visualities of these things? I was thinking particularly someone like sanitary panels, who some of you might have mentioned.
Yes, I have.
Who uses and she uses these sort of stick figures to
Yeah.
her cartoons. So how do you think this is?
A couple of my old students who've gone on to work in this field, Parasmita Singh, A.P. Payal, these are people who are using the form of narrative that they borrow or that they derive from the graphic memoir to take forward concerns that are women related, not always, but sometimes. For instance, Parasmita Singh has spoken very sharply on the way in which the kind of discrimination of AFSPA in the Northeast has particularly affected women. And she said one of the really discouraging things is to find that one is saying the same things over and over and over again about AFSPA and women down the years. So that's one kind of intervention. Another kind of intervention is something that Payal has worked on. She's talked about public health concerns with regard to women, and she has opened up, or she has sought to open up, the distinction between private, biological and public space with regard to a more progressive, a more healthy atmosphere for women. These are experimental, these are working well. 10 years down the road, we'll probably know better. At the moment, I would have only support for this.
May I ask a question? So you talked about gender and these topics, and you mentioned sanitary panels. Excepting for a couple of graphic novels like Curry, and the rest of Amrita Patil's work, do you think that all of these comics that feature gender as a primary element are mostly public awareness related? Looking at the Menstrupedia campaign, for example, and then I'm looking at Priya's Mirror and the rest of those series, Priya Shakti, etc. So most of these seem to be out there for public awareness with a pedagogical component attached. Curry was different. It's about the self and coming to terms with the self, etc. But these recent ones seem more. So are there like examples that you could give us which are more like Curry? These are great, but sanitary panels, like, she's expanded right now. She's not just talking about feminism anymore. She's talking about the government. She got in trouble because of that. All of that's happening as well. So do you think gender right now appears in the comics arena mostly on the public awareness?
See, however much one may reach out and want more fiction, there are 2 or 3 things that have to be negotiated, particularly by young people trying to enter the field. The first is this question of funding. Projects that tend to have a public health dimension tend to be more generously funded, and this may seem like a very snooty point to make, but when young people are actually trying to begin something, it makes all the difference in the world. The other thing is, I would say that there is a greater interest, particularly in northern India. I do not know enough of the south, so I should not speak, but certainly in northern India, there is a very much greater interest and reliance on lines that derive from graphic memoir rather than from graphic fiction. No doubt that will change with the passage of time, but as of now, that is what I would say. It's a much more inviting and an open field to people from all disciplines. I would urge that.
I'm also going to just add here that a lot of comics work in India happens in sort of different spaces, right? So there's the sort of the small scale things, right? The Power Collective, the Kokachi Studio, Mantare, that kind of thing. And there are a lot of women involved in many of these. I think in the mainstream, in the graphic novel space, you're right. I can think of also Sita's Ramayana, which is both drawn and written by women. Himayana has women involved. So does the Gardener in the Wasteland. So there are a fair amount of women sort of working in the space, I think, but they don't always make it into the mainstream consciousness, right? But like we don't all go around talking about the Vyoms. But that doesn't mean they're not doing it. So,
going back to your question about gender and how and what women are doing about it, I think firstly there are a lot of men who are talking about gender as well, not just women. Secondly, in terms of women, I still see a dichotomy because I still see a lot of women are. I still see there is a culture of silencing. And as with what happened with me, I mean, a lot of very powerful women silenced me when I tried speaking up against the men who have harassed me, and continue to silence me. A lot of people have looked away. A lot of people have avoided me professionally. A lot of people, I think, still a lot of women don't have the guts to write about it, to name and to actually bring out the, come out with the stories. So that's as far as harassment goes. I think it's still something taboo, and it's still something you need more people to come out and have the guts to sacrifice their careers, and the people who look away, who don't have the courage to stand up for you, to do. And as far as a personal take on gender goes, as far as things like coming out of the closet, talking about sanitary hygiene, sanitary, problems, health, etc. I think there's definitely an active movement towards it. Many people have a voice. Many people have been, like Menstrupedia, for example, like there's the sanitary panels. A lot of people are coming out and talking about subjects which are not that easily spoken about otherwise. But yes, harassment, I feel, is still relatively silenced. Yeah. Even physical and sexual abuse, I feel, I mean, maybe some books like Priya's Shakti dealt with it, but not in a very adequate manner. I mean, they are looking at it from a very superhero sort of a perspective, but not from a very real perspective of what the emotions and what the exact emotions of a victim are, and the trials and tribulations of a victim are. So that's something that I'm trying to do through my work. Yeah.
Actually, Hush does that, but Hush is both written and illustrated by men. So.
Oh yes.
So
which makes it quite interesting, actually. Yes.
And I mean, of course, I think like one of the things about Hush is, I don't know how many of you have read it, but it ends up with the victim of abuse. You don't mind us spoiling this, right? It ends up with the victim of abuse shooting her abuser, and then herself. So.
No, I didn't know.
Sorry. I hope I didn't ruin it for you.
No, not at all.
But I mean, there's something to be said for this kind of image of abuse that doesn't really offer much hope for the victim's future, and she's a child. So.
Sure. Agreed.
I also want, I mean, you were talking about gender as a theme in your work. What other sorts of themes, what other things do you tend to work with?
So, two of the very relevant and consistent themes in my work are touch and dignity. I think the idea of discovering your sense of dignity and how easy it is for us in a society where it's supposed to be cool to be frivolous with how you're with your boundaries, to retain your sense of dignity, find it, to how you lose it. So how you lose your sense of dignity, how easily you lose your sense of dignity, how it's developed over the time, how everybody has a right to a sense of dignity. It's not something that a person has based on their credentials. Everybody is entitled to a sense of dignity by virtue of being human. So dignity is something that I talk about through my work. Dignity and self-respect, which are different. Dignity is inherent, self-respect is developed. Self-respect is what you can very easily lose. And I talk about how it evolves, how you develop your sense of self-respect, how it's how easy it is to lose it, and how important it is to have a strong sense of self-respect and boundaries. So that's something that I talk about through my work a lot. Touch is something that I discuss. I discuss the politics of touch. What exactly is good touch? What exactly is bad touch? What exactly is consent? What are the different levels of consent? What are the factors that decide what are the factors that influence touch? So these are some of the topics that come under touch that I talk about through my work. Apart from these, I'm also talking about, like I said, there's gender issues like physical abuse, sexual abuse, harassment. Apart from these, I talk about related concepts like normalcy. So normality is something that's very pertinent to my work, because whenever you're talking about gender and especially women's issues, a woman is constantly made to feel by men that she's not normal enough, that there's something wrong with her, that she's not sound. And that's where I study the concept of normality. What exactly is normality? What exactly is the concept of madness? What do you call normal, and where do you transcend the lines into madness? And that's something I study through my work. Apart from that, I study modern day relationships, which again comes under the periphery of gender, but I like to study how the depth of connection is lost in modern day relationships, and what exactly is left of modern day relationships. So these are some of the topics that I talk about. Besides these, they're all connected. Besides these, there's also identity and yes, an important topic I talk about is sensitization. So sensitization and desensitization. So my work questions whether you should desensitize to adjust to a certain culture, or whether you should sensitize the culture. So, and I have tried both as a person. I have tried desensitization as a coping mechanism as well as sensitization. So, sensitization is something I feel is very important, and I talk about it through my work. So, these are some of the themes I discuss. Yeah.
Christel, actually, can I bring you in here to talk about the idea of normality and how it works in the cartooning space? I feel like that's one of the things that a caricature is sort of pushing against, right?
I think with regard to pictorial satire, the assumption that is generally made is that the situations, the characters that are picked up for the panel are clearly such hideous deviations from the norm of political and cultural acceptability that they need to be studied, they need to be not only laughed at, but studied as examples of the dangers of accessing on one or more than one point. And for example, yesterday when we were looking at those cartoons on Sri Lanka, one of the things that came out was this: the norm would be non-interference in the affairs of a sovereign state, which is of course the myth that Sri Lanka keeps hurling in those cartoons at India. But the reason for the pictorial intervention is precisely the opposite, which is that a sovereign state cannot be allowed to continually erase one particular community on grounds of ethnicity. So the norm is sort of bounced about, it is examined, but more often than not, it is set up as something that is, it's taken for granted. It is taken for granted, just as all the examples of pictorial satire are equally taken for granted as aberrations from the norm, which is why sometimes it is thought of as a less than radical genre.
I mean, I was also thinking about someone like Lakshman's Common Man, right? Whose job in the cartoon is to be the norm, right? Be that little figure of normality. How does something like that work?
That's a difficult sort of a question, largely because my sense of Lakshman is a little, well, away from the norm. I would say that the norm that Lakshman invokes is located by Lakshman not as being within the figure of the common man, but as being within the consciousness of the reader who looks at those panels, because the common man is something of an uncommon figure. In Lakshman's mind, he is very much someone who betokens a certain kind of income class education position. But speaking for myself, and certainly for those who are younger than myself, I don't ever see anybody even vaguely resembling the common man. Now, this is not a condemnation, this is a marker of disquiet. And if I were to bring in gender here, I would say there are moments when the wife of the common man comes in. She's a holy terror, if you like, because she's significantly larger than the common man. She doesn't actually wield the balan. She comes pretty close to doing it, and she is aggressive. She is as talkative as the common man is silent. And whether this is to be taken as an example of Lakshman's progressive thoughts, or whether this is to be taken as an example of now let us look away, this is truly regressive, I do not know. But I notice this, and I notice that the wife of the common man makes alliances with figures like Seshan, like Mayavati, like Jayalalitha. These are alliances that the common man would die 1,000 deaths before he makes.
I mean, one of the things that's also at play in something like this is there's a lot of, I mean, you said regressive, but I'm going to also add stereotypes that are at work in a cartoon like this, right? I mean, do you think, how do you think that works? You think that Lakshman is sort of putting them out there? You think he's mocking them? You think that stereotype is being satirized itself?
6 of one and half a dozen of the other. I would say that yes, with pictorial satire there is always this occupational hazard. Mobilize a comic stereotype, use it, you will be dubbed regressive. Refrain from comic stereotypes, you will almost not get your argument off the ground, because you will never have more than 3 panels at the most, well, sometimes even 1. So that is why I would say I would not be too judgmental about the use of comic stereotypes. I would be judgmental about the response to that use that we get.
Dyuti, would you like to talk about,
Talk about comic panels?
No, talk about the sort of, talk about the pictorial stereotypes, visual stereotypes. How do you go out of your way to avoid them, that kind of thing?
Can we move to the next question?
Sure.
The next question I was also going to ask you, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about where would you place the politics of your comics, right?
Right.
Gender, definitely.
Right. So gender is the main area that I'm focusing on, and other than that, there's social constructs. So I'm challenging social constructs like hierarchy, power, structures, stature, normalcy, which is where I think my work would be in the political sphere. It would be considered as something breaking conventions simply, and yes, even in gender, I am trying to, by speaking up against say harassment, abuse, um, and um, and talking about consent and touch, I am trying to break conventions. So that's where I think the politics would lie. Yeah.
We started by talking about animal imagery and figures, hybrid figures, that sort of makes animal characteristics, human characteristics, and how that allows us to speak about things that might not be so easy to say, or how that allows for them to find creativity when you're saying something. So I was also thinking of one of the images from one of your works.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Innocence and abuse. Yes. Yes. Oh, that's another one. That's called the Festival of No Boundaries.
Right. So I was thinking of that image, where you have this minuscule figure of the bird and then you have all these wolves.
Right.
So where you're in a sense drawing upon how the wolf is a symbol of competition.
Yes.
And violence. So I was thinking, how do you think about when you incorporate animal figures in your work? So how do you turn the work? How do you think about
I think for me, animals are visually very enticing. So it's mostly visually, they really, they can really stress on the violence of something because their inherent nature is violent. So I'm not saying all animals are like that, but animal nature inherently is violent. So I think where you need to show that raw violence and energy, I think animals are a very good metaphor, and I also feel visually they're very enticing to draw and look at. They create a very, whether that's in Mouse or other graphic novels which have used animals as used graphic novels as humans, used animals as humans. I think they're just a very visually enticing symbol. So there's both of those qualities. Yeah.
And of course, they show up in cartoons a whole bunch, right? Animals take on all kinds of symbolic jobs in cartoons.
Right.
They do. Now, I'm not very sure how successfully they always manage that because, for example, in the way in which Northern India conceptualizes the jackal, it's a very different kind of conceptualization to the way in which Western Europe handles the jackal. And when you get illustrators like Lockwood Kipling, you see the kind of systemic clash, and the resultant images, they may be beautiful, but they do not always carry a clear-cut political charge. Now, we cannot say every illustration has to carry that kind of a clear-cut charge, true. But to validate the presence of these images, yes, a certain kind of cutting-edge politics would have been helpful.
Okay, I had a slightly unhelpful question to ask both of you, which is I wanted to ask, what kind of visual style do you most gravitate to? In your case, when you're working, Christel, when you're sort of thinking about visualizations, thinking about cartoons.
Okay. for me, sensuality and flow are very important through my work and as a visual style. So that is the style that and that sensuality also comes from me being a feminist and having gone through experiences of harassment and wanting to make the world a more beautiful and a more gentle and soft space where there's equality, where there's respect for softness, and so that's where the flow and sensuality comes into the work.
Can I
yes.
just break in and ask about some of your visual influences that you feel do this kind of flow well?
Actually, there are none. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. It's
In
just
other
something that-
media, like in other kinds of things. Like
Yes,
maybe
I've seen dance performances by friends which do that. Very sensuous, beautiful performances. But in terms of visual media, I can't think of a particular example where I see that kind of a flow visually. Yeah. But yes, in dance, in movies, yes, certainly. Many examples. Yeah. So going back to what I was talking about, so yes, sensuality and flow is something that's consistently a style in my work, and of course, like I said, a certain sensitivity with lines, wherein I'm drawing every groove of the line, so that that's something that the visual style stresses on sensitivity and depth, and going into the depths of things. So that's something that all of it reflects my desires for how I want the world to be. Yeah.
So jump forward by one slide. So skip the next and go to the one after that. Thank you. I would say, if I were thinking about visual styles, I would say a fineness of nib signaling a fineness of understanding, and I suspect part of that component is a mockery of the inability to understand. I would signal this piece by Ravi Shankar as a good example of what I would value because, first of all, if I might use the term, integrity of the frog is preserved. He is nothing other than a frog at first glance, except that if you look at the instrument, you will notice that it's not merely one that we know backwards in our part of the world. It is also a good question mark as to what constitutes Indianness, because the notion of the Indian is a notion that is like any other critical concept, open to question, open to a certain amount of skepticism. So here is the distinctly obtuse, bloated, pompous frog signaling an affiliation to a particular kind of Indianness. And last of all, I will say, I like the way in which the gap between aspiration, however obtuse, and achievement, however limited, is indicated. When Shalini asks me that question, I will answer you. Yeah. Okay. This was very simply, Meenakshi, this was a crazy disappointment of mine. You remember I was talking about the formation of a course. Now, both here and Atul, if you go to the next slide, you will recall this particular poem, not necessarily from its positioning in Beastly Tales, but from the fact that the CBSE prescribes it for Standard 10 unfailingly, and also supplies illustration of its own. Now, the CBSE does not or has not brokered a copyright deal with Ravi Shankar, so they use their in-house illustrator. The in-house illustrator is not this person, I should hasten to add, because here we have color, and textbooks do not as a rule run to color because of pricing issues. Now, having said all of that, what we have in the text that the CBSE generates is a very wishy-washy kind of a drawing, clearly done by, as I say, not just an in-house illustrator, but someone who is picking up what he or she can without any precise regard to the poem. Now, on the one hand, we might say, if we want to look at the poem in all its clarity, in the process of syllabus formation, let us go back to the original, the first edition, Ravi Shankar illustrating for Vikram Seth. On the other hand, and this is the point my MPhil students made, it's not always easy to get the so-called original illustrations. They have made do with illustrations from the second and third edition, which have not taken forward this kind of ironical skepticism. Understandably, because Ravi Shankar begins as a cartoonist, other illustrations such as the one here do not. These are illustrators who believe in taking forward the didactic moral value of the tale, which suits the CBSE, because if you look at the agenda of the CBSE, it will say very clearly it is concerned with an education in value, an education in moral didacticism. Therefore, it prescribes and it says it wants poems of a certain length. So, the Frog and the Nightingale sits in the same text as daffodils. I have never figured out the moral value of daffodils. However, the point is that when we sit, the same people who enjoy looking at illustrations, theorizing illustration, when we sit down to rough out a syllabus, when we think about the values that matter, market values, moral values, a good deal of what we think about images, discuss about images, that goes out the window, and yes, that is a great discipline.
Thanks, Christel. I'm just going to ask you the rest of that question now, which is sort of bringing us back to the beginning of our conversation, right? So, how do you then go about teaching, making a curriculum, that kind of thing, if you want to teach people how to read an image?
See, there are lots of guidelines. Meenakshi, you mentioned curry. We have prescribed curry in one of our undergrad papers. Now, two concerns were raised. First, the prescription of a graphic text under UGC norms. A comparable literary text has always to be mandated for those who are visually challenged. Now, on the face of it, that may seem fine, but it is not easy. It does mean that the range of texts that we prescribe has to be limited. So, if we prescribe a gardener in the wasteland, then we have to have Ghulamgiri. If we prescribe Himalayan, then we have to have waiting for a visa. That's one set of guidelines that go alongside syllabus prescription. Another set of guidelines is what I will call Delhi University is a collegiate university. And many colleges say that the students whom they get may not be able to take the graphic visuality of texts, many of the texts that come out of the states, for example, and that also makes it difficult. Another concern, now this is something where my colleague Raj, who is coming later in the week, he was very helpful. When we prescribed Himalayan, it was the colored text that Navayana had brought out. It's expensive, our students said so. We had to negotiate for a reduced price for textbook consumption. Sometimes we get editions that are decolorized, that are black and white. But a text like Mouse, it's a very popular text, Dyuti. It's something that all students relate to, but it is again extremely expensive. So we have had to put it in an optional course. Now the optional course for visual studies is therefore an expensive course, and teachers are beginning to voice the concern of students. So these are areas where we have very little space to negotiate.
How does that work for you, Dyuti? I mean, from a literary studies point of view, it works like this. Like, for you, how when you're learning about visuality, when you're learning how to read it, how to create it for yourself, how does that kind of learning work?
In what, work in what context?
I mean, I guess I was asking how did you come to end up with this sort of very distinct sense of this is how Dyuti's work looks, right? So how did you get there?
Like I said during my presentation, you come to a point, when you start exploring deeply, you come to a point where your philosophies and your visual style starts blending. And that's what happened with me. So, you know, I was unencumbered by what was being done outside of me. Like, I was not influenced by anything, but my philosophies of wanting to see a more beautiful, equal world, a more sensitive world, of sensuality, all of that sort of started coming together into my work and became a visual style. So, you know, I think when you keep exploring, when you keep reflecting, when you keep looking within, and when you keep also like questioning yourself, then you will your philosophies, and you start understanding yourself and your philosophies. Then those philosophies will will bleed into your visual style and your work, and everything will sort of come together and create magic. So that's what it is.
So I could comic really like, okay, this is my style now. Sort of change styles between
Yes,
Flaw and the later works.
Flaw and the later works, yes. So Flaw was just an exploration into form and content, because I was creating expressive portraits at the same time that I was creating Flaw, and Flaw was more about expressing a philosophy with as little expression as possible, while keeping form as limited as possible to the content necessary to be communicated, and at the same time creating works which were completely expressive. So, you know, that was just an inquiry in form and content, but that didn't give me a voice or a style. It was when I started working ahead and came to a point where working with the taboo, working on the taboo for this side, that side, that I realized that I'm discovering a language, that I'm discovering with jackals and Arabs, with the taboo. I realized that a language was appearing, of the way I like my text, of the way I like to like the visuals to flow, the lines to follow, how the page should look, how I like the pages to flow into each other. So all of that started happening naturally by that time. Yeah.
And all the figures sort of start
Yes, yes.
crammed together in particular
Absolutely. Also, like, I realized that I had problems drawing by imagination. And by that time, I realized I started finding a way to draw human figures without actually worrying about, like I was telling these guys, you don't have to worry about not knowing how to draw exactly the way it should be, you know. So that's when I started getting the confidence to draw human figures a certain way without worrying too much about how they don't look like human figures exactly, so, or animal figures exactly. So that's also something that happened at the same time. But mostly, yes, it was around the time of Jackals and Arabs and Flaw that I started, and Taboo, where I started also making my work expressive, not just communicative, but expressive. Yes.
We can actually, on this note, we can actually
Throw this open for questions. Feel free to also tell us about how you learned to read images, how you learned about visuality, and so on.
Any questions? Questions, comments, responses?
So all of these topics that we began with, you spoke about abstraction, distortion, and the beast fable, and about breaking visual stereotypes. The one person I was thinking about really was Apupan, and the crazy kind of world building that happens in his books. I was thinking of Aspirus specifically, where it's all a dream sequence. You know, you have a lot of beasts, but none of those beasts are recognizable. There is no animal that we have ever seen, you know, and each of those beasts in there is constantly changing. So it's not a question, it's just one thing that seemed to tie together everything. Plus, there is a lot of satire as well, because every 20 pages you see that he draws a page full of, it's just an advertisement which contains characters that he has created. So, that kind of seems like a good example that ties up all of these visual conventions together, and the breaking of certain conventions as well.
Yes, that's quite true. That is sometimes the result of the author illustrators wanting to point out that these situations have not necessarily occurred before. Hence, there should not be recognition. In fact, there should be the opposite, the absence of recognition. I will play that off against Devdutt Patnaik's work on retelling myth and fable, because time and time again when Patnaik works, he deliberately gives us non-realistic representations of Mathura, Hastinapur, Banaras, and when you look at them, you will notice that they are not like the cities that we have ever seen at any point in their representation. But, and this is his point, he wants to give people a sense of a citadel that has been broken down, or that is in the process of being broken down, and therefore he gives us these testimonies to the continuing relevance of myth, even while a civilization may simply have got up and walked away from myth. I don't know if that works, but certainly that is something that is done.
I have more of a formal question, as in, like, we have literary satire, and one of the primary sort of aims that a poet or a writer sets out with is a pedagogic goal in the satire, right? It is supposed to not just subvert, undercut, but through that process there is there is some space to posit something like like some pedagogical goal, some instruction, let's just call it. So I was just thinking about what sort of a space does a visual artist have in, say, like a visual satire to achieve that sort of a pedagogical goal or an instructional goal, as in, like, there is not like when like in yesterday's presentation, like the cartoons, like the strips that we looked at, like they were sort of presenting certain situations, they were presenting oppositions, they were sort of undercutting those visuals. But I was looking for a space where they would sort of present sort of some instructional theme as well, if at all.
Okay, within Indian pictorial satire, Gandhi, as in Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, is one of the major tropes for didacticism, teaching space, alternatives to satire, things like that. He's a trope in which Ranga invested all his career, many others have invested a lot. Other tropes, paintings or portraits on the wall. Very often portraits are shown as looking down their nose at the horrifying situations that unfold before their eyes in time present, as opposed to the idealism of time past. So that's another area of possible teaching pedagogical value. And the third space is very definitely the focalizers. In the case of Naware, the donkey, Tuk Tuk, the girl, Lakshman's common man. These are spaces again for pedagogical intervention and didacticism. Not a perfect way of dealing with it, but I suspect most pictorial satirists would say it is our business to indicate the difficulties and the gaps, not to fill them. They are not as sympathetic as teachers.
Talking about pedagogy, I want to ask, is there an Indian way of thinking about teaching of these texts? I mean, how do you approach them, and what are the challenges you face in class when students approach them for the first time, and how do you approach them?
A grounding in Indian history is always a good idea. Students tend not to be hugely enthusiastic about it, but then, you see, if they don't get that grounding themselves, they will be reduced to dependence on their teachers they will have to take the word of their teachers for gospel, which is never a good idea. So that is one response. Another response is, now technically I should say there is a tradition of studying pictorial satire within the country. Let us look. Not really. I mean, it is quite true that work done on the Awadh Panch and the rest of those documents, see, by and large, pictorial satire writes to India on the back of empire, by and large. And therefore, a grounding in Indian history, yes, from that time into contemporary space, not an extensive, not a question of drilling deep into Indian culture, no. But that's one thing. And the second thing I would say is, it's always a good idea to look at some of the literary texts that go alongside. The discovery of India for Shankar, a good deal of other biographies for Lakshman, there is space. I would say that is one way to go forward.
If I kind of follow up from what Manoj has said, I was also considering the whole idea of like how would we teach this, not we, you, but how do you teach the whole idea of the pictorial satire to a young adult audience? Like not children basically who are very, you know, where there always comes a sense of responsibility, like there is a sense of morals and ethics, not ethics, but morals and responsibility which kind of come in when you are kind of teaching. But then to young adults who are slightly more mature and who can have, but they're not really mature. So, I mean, I was just like thinking of how would you then consider teaching visual materials?
I understand, and I don't mean to sound unpleasant, but let me put it like this. I would stay with illustration for young adults, not because they are not in a better position to do things, but because I suspect teachers will not have enough time and space in the classroom to do a very solid grounding. That tends to come at research level, and I would therefore keep pictorial satire for research. As I say, it sounds exclusivist, but it is not meant to be like that. My own sense is that if we are not a little careful, we will have the disaster that we had with the Ambedkar cartoon in the insert textbook on the Constituent Assembly.
I'm afraid that's all the time that we have right now. And for a quick formal vote of thanks, we have Manoj.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank all the speakers who talked to us today, Dr. Shalini, Srinivasan, Dyuti, Mittal, and Professor Christel Devadawson. Professor Devadawson, who also gave us a lecture yesterday, and Shalini Srinivasan for the wonderful talk on heroes and what they make and how they make us think of what they are, and Dyuti Mittal for talking about the breaking of boundaries and how she reflects upon it in her art, and Professor Devadawson again for joining us today in this panel discussion. And thank you all, and thanks to all of you for making this a wonderful evening and staying back after lunch. So thanks.